the smell of death. That was the boy they called Thomas, the son even the vultures wouldn't touch in the Appalachian hollers. This isn't some campfire legend. This is the documented, heartbreaking tragedy of the Pritchard family, hidden deep in the folds of Harlan County, Kentucky, where the mountains kept secrets that would horrify even the most seasoned investigators who stumbled upon them in the bitter winter of 1967. Deep in the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky, where a cold dust settled over everything like a shroud and the nearest town was a treacherous 3-hour walk away, the Pritchard family lived in utter isolation. Their home was a weathered cabin from the 1880s, standing at the end of a forgotten logging road that the wilderness had long since reclaimed. No electricity ever broke the darkness of their nights. No running water ever eased their mornings. Time itself seemed to have abandoned this place, leaving the Pritchards to survive in a perpetual state of the 19th century. The family patriarch, Ezekiel Pritchard, was born in 1891 to parents who were themselves first cousins. His wife Martha, born in 1898, shared more than just a surname with Ezekiel when they married in 1914. She was also his niece, the daughter of his older sister who had died in childbirth. In the isolated Appalachian communities of that era, such unions were whispered about but rarely condemned. The drive to survive often trumped societal norms. Keeping land within the family, maintaining bloodlines, and sheer geographic isolation made these unions almost inevitable in the most remote mountain settlements. By 1945, Ezekiel and Martha had 9 children. 7 survived past infancy, though each bore the unmistakable marks of their parents' shared genetics: club feet twisted at impossible angles, eyes that refused to align in a perpetual, unfocused gaze, hearing loss from partial to complete, and speech impediments so severe even family members struggled to understand. But the family persisted. They worked their small plot of land, raised chickens, and kept a vegetable garden that barely saw them through the harsh mountain winters. The true horror began in 1946, when the eldest surviving son, Jacob, then 28 years old, began a relationship with his own sister, Rebecca, who was 23. In communities this isolated, where the nearest eligible partner might live 2 valleys away and travel was so treacherous, such unions happened more often than the history books care to admit. The Pritchard gene pool had become a closed loop, spiraling inward with each generation. Rebecca gave birth to her first child in April 1947. The baby, a girl named Sarah, seemed relatively normal at birth, though severe skeletal abnormalities would emerge by age 2. Her legs bowed so dramatically walking became impossible. Her spine curved in an unnatural S-shape that caused constant pain. But Sarah survived, her world extending no further than the family's 50 acres. Between 1947 and 1959, Rebecca bore 7 more children to her brother Jacob. 3 died before their first birthday, their tiny bodies buried in unmarked graves behind the cabin, their deaths never reported. The 4 who survived displayed increasingly severe physical manifestations of recessive genetic disorders. Microcephaly, where the skull and brain failed to develop properly, appeared in 2. Profound intellectual disabilities affected all 4. But it was the 5th child, born on a frigid January morning in 1953, who would become known to the outside world by a name that still haunts the records of Harlan County. They called him Thomas, though investigators would later refer to him only as Subject P5. Thomas Pritchard entered this world with a genetic condition so rare and devastating that fewer than 30 cases had been documented globally at that time. His body couldn't process certain proteins, causing a metabolic disorder that produced a distinctive, overwhelming odor. It permeated everything he touched, everything he wore, the very air around him. The smell wasn't just unpleasant. It was the stench of necrosis, of tissue breaking down, of death itself. By 6 months old, even his own mother struggled to hold him. The odor embedded itself in the cabin's fabrics, wood, and walls. Local wildlife avoided the property. Hunting dogs from neighboring homesteads would whimper and refuse to advance within a mile. As Thomas grew, the condition worsened. Lesions covered his skin and wouldn't heal. His teeth rotted and fell out by age 7. His internal organs were slowly being poisoned by the same metabolic dysfunction. But perhaps most tragically, Thomas possessed a sharp, aware mind trapped in a body that was decomposing while he still lived. He understood his condition. He could feel the revulsion in his family's eyes. He knew he was dying slowly, day by day. The family tried everything within their limited means. They bathed him in creek water mixed with lye soap that burned his skin. They wrapped him in layers of old cloth. Finally, they built him a separate shed 50 yards from the main cabin, where he spent most of his existence alone, isolated even from his already isolated family. By 1960, when Thomas was 7, the situation had become unsustainable. Ezekiel died in 1958 at 67, worn down by hard labor. Martha followed in early 1960, likely succumbing to pneumonia in a brutal winter. This left Jacob, now 42, as patriarch of a family that included his sister-wife Rebecca, their surviving children, including the deteriorating Thomas, and several younger siblings who were themselves products of Ezekiel and Martha's consanguineous union. The family's isolation might have continued forever, if not for a chance encounter. On October 14, 1967, a coal company surveying team stumbled upon the Pritchard homestead. What they found would trigger one of the most disturbing investigations into familial consanguinity ever documented in Appalachia. Conf J. Increased Edal, the stories we uncover here are not fiction. They are the hidden tragedies history tried to bury, and you need to witness them before they disappear forever. The survey team, Richard Coleman, a 34-year-old geologist, Martin Hayes, a 29-year-old surveyor, and their local guide, Eugene Watts, approached the cabin. They were met by an experience Coleman would call the most profoundly disturbing sensory assault I have ever experienced. The smell hit them a quarter-mile out. Eugene, a World War II veteran, said it was worse than any battlefield, a smell of human decay with an acidic chemical quality that made their eyes water and throats close. As they neared, they saw the main cabin and several outbuildings. Chickens wandered, but avoided one particular small structure. No birds sang. No wildlife seemed present. Jacob Pritchard emerged from the cabin. At 49, he looked decades older, his face bearing the features of consanguinity, walking with a severe limp. His speech was slurred and difficult to understand. The conversation was brief and tense. Jacob was defensive, ordering them to leave. But through a window, Martin Hayes had glimpsed figures inside, including children with visible deformities. And that smell, it seemed to emanate from the isolated shed. The men left and drove straight to the Harlan County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff James Dockery listened with growing concern. He knew the Pritchard name. They'd been left alone for generations. But the surveyor's account, of deformed children and that horrifying smell, compelled him to act. The next morning, he assembled a team, 2 deputies, County Health Inspector Dorothy Marshall, and Dr. Robert Chun, one of only 3 physicians in the county. After nearly 2 hours of negotiation at the cabin door, Jacob finally lowered his old rifle and let them in. Dorothy Marshall would later describe the interior as the most heartbreaking scene of her career. 8 people lived in the 3-room structure. Rebecca, now 44, sat rocking vacantly in a corner. 3 of her surviving children were present, 20-year-old Sarah, confined to a chair, 17-year-old Daniel, functioning at a toddler's level, and 14-year-old Ruth, blind and showing signs of microcephaly. 2 of Jacob's younger siblings were also there, bearing clear physical marks. But it was the questioning about the smell that led to the devastating discovery. Dr. Chun noticed everyone glancing toward the window facing the shed. When he asked if someone else lived there, the room fell silent. Finally, Sarah spoke in a weak, trembling voice. "My brother Thomas is in the shed. He has been sick his whole life. Please do not make him leave. He will die without us." Sheriff Dockery and Dr. Chun approached the small structure. The smell became almost unbearable at 20 feet. Dr. Chun called out, identifying himself as a doctor. A weak, raspy, but articulate voice responded from inside, "I know why you are here. I have been expecting someone to come eventually. You may enter, but please, I ask you to bring me some dignity in whatever happens next." What they found inside would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. Thomas Pritchard, 14 years old, sat on a crude wooden cot covered in cloths darkened by bodily secretions. His skin showed extensive lesions and discoloration. He was emaciated, weighing maybe 70 pounds. He had no teeth. But his eyes were clear, alert, and intelligent, a cruel contrast to his physical state. The shed was a prison. Buckets served as a toilet. A few precious, yellowed books sat on a makeshift shelf, evidence he had taught himself to read. Charcoal drawings of mountains and birds, the world he could only observe through cracks in the walls, hung nearby. Dr. Chun knew Thomas needed urgent medical care. The discovery also raised immediate legal and ethical questions. Were these children being held against their will? Had crimes been committed? How do you respond to suffering born of consanguinity, not malice? The aftermath consumed the county's limited services for months. An ambulance was called to transport Thomas to Harlan ARH Hospital. The journey alone nearly killed him. His body went into shock. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to stabilize him. Tests revealed the extent of his metabolic disorder. His body was poisoning itself. In 1967, there was no cure, only palliative care. Thomas spent 6 weeks in a quarantined room. The smell permeated the ward. Nurses drew straws for his care, but once assigned, treated him with compassion. Thomas himself showed remarkable grace. He asked questions about the outside world, about technology, about life beyond his mountains. Meanwhile, officials grappled with the homestead. Dorothy Marshall's interviews pieced together a multi-generational tragedy. Rebecca had limited capacity to understand her decisions. There was no one else, she said. Jacob was kind to me. We were alone. Jacob was defensive. My own mother and father were cousins, he stated. This is how it has always been here. We keep to ourselves. We survive. Uncovered family records showed a pattern of closed, consanguineous unions spanning 5 generations, a family tree that was a tangled vine looping back on itself. Dr. Chun consulted with geneticist Dr. Patricia Holbrook from the University of Kentucky. Even with 1967's limited genetics, the implications were clear. Each instance of consanguineous reproduction increases the probability recessive disorders will manifest, Dr. Holbrook explained. Over multiple generations, the accumulation becomes almost inevitable. The Pritchards were a case study in genetic degradation. But beyond the science was a human tragedy. These were victims of circumstance, isolation, and poverty. The legal system struggled. Prosecutors considered charges, but there was no evidence of deliberate cruelty. The suffering was from genetic inheritance, not active harm. In November 1967, a judge removed the youngest children to a specialized facility in Lexington. Sarah, Daniel, and Ruth were taken from the only home they'd ever known. Sarah cried, "I want to go home," until her voice gave out. Thomas remained hospitalized. Dr. Chun allowed Jacob and Rebecca supervised visits twice a week. The family sat in uncomfortable silence. Thomas tried to comfort them. "You did the best you could. I do not blame you for my suffering here." Thomas wants you to understand something crucial. Think about what he said to his parents, and comment below, "You did the best you could." Because sometimes the greatest tragedies aren't born from evil, but from circumstances beyond anyone's control. Thomas Pritchard died on March 3, 1968, at 2:47 a.m. He was 15. The cause was multi-organ failure. The nurses knew the truth. He died from 15 years of genetic degradation, isolation, a body fighting itself since birth. In his final weeks, Thomas asked for his story to be documented, not to condemn his family, but so others might avoid such suffering. Dr. Chun arranged for a stenographer. The 3-hour transcript remains in the Harlan County Archives, a devastating first-hand account. "I remember my mother crying the first time she held me when I was perhaps 3 or 4, Thomas said. I could see in her face that the smell was unbearable, but she was trying so hard not to show it. I learned very young that I was different. My sister Sarah taught me to read when I was 6. I read those same 5 books hundreds of times. I memorized entire chapters because there was nothing else to occupy my mind during the long hours alone. The pain was constant. The smell, which everyone found so horrible, I became blind to after a while. But I never became blind to the isolation it caused. Most heartbreaking was his compassion for his parents. I do not hate my mother and father. They are themselves victims of something they never understood. How can I blame them for circumstances that were set in motion generations before they were born? This testimony became crucial. It catalyzed a University of Kentucky study of genetic isolation in eastern Kentucky. Their 1970 survey of remote hollers found evidence of consanguineous unions in 43 families. The study created controversy, accused of perpetuating stereotypes, but also highlighted a genuine public health crisis. For the Pritchards, Thomas's death began a slow dispersal. Jacob and Rebecca were allowed back to the homestead with monthly checks. Sarah, Daniel, and Ruth remained in institutional care. Sarah died in 1983 at 36. Daniel in 1991 at 41. Ruth in 2004 at 51. The shed collapsed in a mid-70s storm. Jacob died in 1974, Rebecca in 1976, buried in the small family cemetery. The property was auctioned for taxes in 1980. The new owners tore down the structures, knowing nothing of its history. The case had lasting impacts. Kentucky passed stricter laws on consanguineous marriage and allocated more funds for rural health care and services. Dr. Chun devoted his career to rural medicine and genetic counseling, establishing a traveling clinic. Dr. Holbrook used the case in teaching, always emphasizing the family's humanity. The broader social impact was complex. The case fed harmful Appalachian stereotypes, but also sparked vital conversations about poverty, isolation, and public health. It advanced understanding of genetic inheritance and the need for genetic counseling. Yet, the human tragedy remains. Thomas spent 15 years trapped, suffering, yet maintaining his humanity. In his final testimony, he said, "I have thought often about what my life might have been. But I also think about my parents, my siblings. We were all prisoners of something that started long before any of us were born. If my story can help prevent even one family from experiencing this suffering, then perhaps my life had some purpose beyond pain." We understand the genetics now with precision we couldn't have imagined in 1967. But we can't restore Thomas's lost years. We can't undo that suffering. The Pritchard homestead is gone, reclaimed by forest. Thomas's grave sits in a small cemetery outside Harlan, with a stone paid for by Dr. Chun. The epitaph reads, "He suffered without bitterness and left this world with grace." Medical students and public health officials sometimes visit, paying respects to a boy whose suffering contributed to knowledge that has helped countless others. The lessons remain relevant. In isolated communities worldwide, consanguinity still occurs, driven by isolation, culture, and poverty. Thomas's story teaches that genetic science must always be paired with compassion, that the goal is never to condemn, but to prevent suffering. The Pritchard family wasn't evil. They were victims of circumstances that overwhelmed them. As we conclude, remember, behind every statistic are real human beings who suffered. Thomas Pritchard was one. A boy who smelled like death, isolated and in pain, who kept his humanity until the end. His story is a call to remember connection, community, and to ensure no family becomes so isolated they fall victim to preventable circumstances. If you've stayed until the end, you've witnessed a heartbreaking chapter. Confer-Ja and Scredo Nescathi's true accounts need to be remembered, not sensationalized, but honored for the human suffering they represent. Se voca assist aki apport. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the fragility of genetics and the importance of compassion, please leave a like. Share it. These stories matter. These lives mattered. Remembering them honors not just Thomas Pritchard, but all who have suffered in silence, and commits us to ensuring such tragedies are never repeated.